Looking to get more of an overview on sustainability and food security, I decided to stay in London and catch up with Emma Piercy from the Food and Drink Federation. So it was off to the FDF HQ next.
So I'm here with Emma Piercy from the FDF, Head of Climate Change and Energy Policy. Emma, thank you so much for having me here in your headquarters.
You're very welcome, and it's so great to finally meet you in person.
I know, right? It's so refreshing, isn't it? Just not being on a screen.
Definitely, and you get to realise that actually people are of different heights. Not all the same. On the computer, you do look all the same.
I'm very small. So I've been, talking to a lot of people over the course of the last few weeks to create this documentary, and I've been finding out a lot about how climate change relates to food security. So I just wanted to pick your brains, obviously as a sustainability expert, around supply chains and climate change. So with lots of severe kind of weather patterns happening, we're obviously going to see impacts within our supply chain. So how can producers look to sort of, I suppose, avoid those, or at least work with those disruptions?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the first things is in a sense to look at the assessment of where your risks are in the supply chain. So there is a piece of regulation called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it's requiring large companies at the moment, but will start to be rolled out, to do this assessment on where there may be some exposure in their businesses. So that's probably like a first step in a way. And I think what's really interesting when we look at the UK market is that actually most of our fruit and veg comes from Spain, for example, and southern Spain is one of the 10, in terms of worldwide, it's one of the 10 areas that is most at risk around water scarcity. So that in itself should start, obviously, to start ringing alarm bells, and not least, I suppose, with what's happening with fruit and veg at the moment. I think it's actually due to the temperature in Spain at the moment and floods in North Africa. But nevertheless, these are signals for us to really start looking at where the risk is in supply chains and starting to mitigate. I think, another aspect in terms of, what companies can do, it's almost, I would say, looking at some of the lessons that we can learn from the war in Ukraine and what impact that has had. So whether, for example, we could look at energy supply and prices, but also the aspect of specific agricultural commodities. Now, when we look at how companies have responded to those challenges, so let's look at agricultural commodities like sunflower oil, for example. Well, they've now started to diversify into other oils, and other aspects can actually be through, which is kind of similar, I suppose, is a sort of reformulation and looking at the ingredients within your products and maybe looking at amending some of the volume of those or swapping to help reduce that risk. So there's a few things there, but really understanding the products, where the ingredients are from, what kind of exposure to risk is there for those, and identifying alternatives, almost a bit like plan Bs and Cs, I suppose.
There seems to be quite a few kind of routes. I mean, if producers were to put a plan in place, where would you sort of say should be the kind of the starting point?
Well, there's a phrase, you can't manage what you can't measure. Yeah. So you really need to start with understanding that let's say that footprint of the product that you're producing. So let's say, looking at carbon emissions, so UK-wide, when we look at the food that we consume in the UK, 2/3 of that carbon footprint actually comes from ingredients, and roughly that is equally split between let's say UK generated emissions and emissions that have come from ingredients imported from abroad. So then you start to see, so we're taking this as an example, then you start to see, well, to what extent are you then able to influence the sort of emission reductions in those ingredients, whether they be UK sourced or from abroad. And you start to think about the stakeholders, and clearly, I suppose as a manufacturer, you'd be engaging with your suppliers, and it's thinking about what questions to ask your suppliers in how they source their ingredients from a variety of environmental indicators, whether it be water usage, whether it's the agricultural practice employed in terms of the crops and how they're grown. So the regenerative agriculture we've heard a lot about, and sort of sustainable practices. And there's obviously a lot of different indicators, but I think that's where the conversation starts. It's around the footprinting to begin with, and then that starts to open up to other avenues of where you can take it. The mapping is really important. I think as a really strong place to start.
We'll come back to sort of food manufacturers in a moment. You mentioned obviously what's going on. You go into a supermarket, you can't buy tomatoes. I think my other half said to me, you couldn't get any peppers. He came back and went, why can't we get peppers? And I was like, well, I actually know the answer to this. Do you think that consumers are actually aware about what's causing these shortages? And the reason I ask this is because, generally speaking, when we see a movement like a push for more sustainable practice within the industry, it's generally consumer driven. Is that fair to say? Is it fair to say that consumers are aware and they're driving this with food manufacturers, or are food manufacturers going, well, we actually need to do something here because there's a big issue, and kind of taking the responsibility?
I don't think consumers really are aware, no. And it's something I've been reflecting on recently, that in this wider context of whether it's moving to net zero or dealing with the causes and consequences of climate change, we really need to have an open, honest, transparent conversation with all stakeholders, and consumers need to be at the centre of it. And I think it was interesting, I think it was just before COVID, we had climate assemblies where, the sort of public and a whole range of, people from different communities, different types of jobs, parts of society, all came together to discuss these issues in terms of climate. And I kind of think that actually, when we look at the role of food systems and climate change, UK's carbon footprint, food systems is about 22%. People don't realise this. And of course, we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Now, these topics are extremely challenging, and I think it's very difficult to be able to get to the crux of the issues and how we can really take them forward without being really transparent on this whole picture. So I think moving forward, in terms of then how do we deal with immediate crises such as the ones we're experiencing at the moment, actually, that this will awaken this will increase the knowledge within all stakeholders to address some of those points we looked at already. So looking at where you're sourcing, looking at better use of the natural resources, so the water. And RAP, for example, are doing some great projects in southern Spain to improve and address the water scarcity issue with some targets around 2030. And so this all helps drive that action. So the more awareness, the more that momentum builds on driving that action to address it. And I think we probably will see more seasonal eating, because actually it's that will be what's most readily available, and also when you combine it with whether we talk about healthy, sustainable diets, that social, economic, and environmental aspect, that all comes into that too, and helps, I think, with the affordability issue as well. So I think there'll be a few different outcomes that we'll see from this.
Going back to the food producer and all of these things that they're going to have to manage, what support needs to be put in place for them to achieve this?
Well, I suppose you could look at this from a couple of different angles. I think maybe I'll start with manufacturing, as I think that's probably where most of my comments would lie. And that is, when you look at the food and drink manufacturing sector in the UK, we're huge. We're the largest sector, bigger than automotive and aviation combined. But 96-97% of those companies are SMEs. Now, when we look at the resources that SMEs have, that's clearly very different to the large multinationals. So when we look at support, actually, this is something that, as an organisation at FDF, that we're really trying to help with. So one example, we have a net zero handbook that we published at COP26.
Yes.
And that looks at the actions and influence that manufacturers can bring to bear at each point of their supply chain. So whether it's ingredients and working with the suppliers, whether it's working with their packaging suppliers, transport. Another area we haven't talked about, actually, the on-site emissions. So the actual manufacturing emissions from electricity and gas use. So, so there you've got a lot of actions that people can take. Now, the biggest issue which all companies face, large or small, of course, is finance and the cost. So that is a major area where companies need support. So, they now know perhaps what to do if we provide them with that help, and now it's financing it. And I think whilst government has made some really great initiatives like this Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, I think really these are projects that are at the start, in the sense of now we need the masses to follow. And how those are going to be financed, well, I think we still have a lot of question marks. And right now, with challenges over the last 2-3 years, whether it's from Brexit, from COVID, and now dealing with the war in Ukraine, a lot of businesses are actually thinking about survival. So we need to be quite clever, I think, both as a trade association, but working with other stakeholders and getting those resources together for businesses. And we have websites out there around energy efficiency. Actually, at FDF, we're now developing our sustainability strategy to really look at how we can best target our resources to help. So we'll see a lot more on this coming this year. So we've got some of the answers, but not all.
You've been a fantastic guest, but I'm going to throw one more question, just one last question to you, which I've been asking quite a few of the experts I've been interviewing. If you were to take over, as you be elected and you were leader for a day, what would be the thing that you would change? What would you do?
Oh, I think I could actually summarise that quite succinctly, I think, in that I would like to see a systems approach to addressing the sustainability challenges in the food system, because what we find is that even with the national food strategy, that came out, or the net zero strategy, perhaps more to the point, that actually when we look at how to reduce the environmental impact of food and dealing with the other challenges around affordability, and so you've got the environmental aspect, the social aspect around food and the economics, that we need a farm to fork approach and a real holistic approach to be able to get those challenges dealt with. And one of your earlier questions was around the role of consumers, and I think consumer behavioural change is a massive part of that, and we won't be successful unless we really incorporate consumers in this process. So this is why we need this holistic approach to be able to make sure that any levers that we pull for any change in the system, that actually at the end of the day they have the outcomes that we're looking for. So maybe, I'm hoping that this new department for energy and net zero maybe that can have that convening effect of putting those different parts of the sector together. Because, of course, as a major manufacturing sector, we cover a number of different government departments. So I'm hoping that when it comes to delivering on net zero, and the fact that we are responsible for, the food system is responsible for a fifth of the UK's carbon footprint, we really need to finally sort of come together and work on those solutions together.
I hope that the story's changed, and maybe if we meet, next year, and we'll be not asking these same questions, but something different. I'm sure there'll be other challenges that we'll be facing,
and hopefully some progress.
Yeah,
yes,
hopefully some
absolutely.
progress. Emma, it's been an absolute delight to finally meet you in person after 4 years.
You too.
Thank you so much for your insights.
You're welcome.
I've learned a lot about the supply chain and climate change, and I thought it would be a good idea to speak to a food security expert. Of course, who better than Timothy Lang of City University?